Good evening and welcome to our first presentation of the year. I'm sorry about that horn. I'm Brent Taylor, the convener of the speaker program for Military History and Heritage Victoria. On behalf of our committee, I welcome you to tonight's Zoom event. Tonight, we're very pleased to have Michael Veitch presenting Australia's Secret Army, the story of Coastwatchers in World War II. Now a little bit about Michael. Michael is a well-known as an author, actor, and former ABC television and radio presenter. His books include critically acclaimed accounts of Australian airmen in World War II, 44 Days, Heroes of the Sky, Fly, Flak, Barney, Great, Rex, Turning Point, and the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. He lives in the Yarra Valley outside Melbourne. Tonight, we've also got James Burrows, the last of the Coastwatchers, as a special guest, and we're expecting he will make some commentary later in the evening. We'll move straight to the proceedings, a little bit about the process before Michael begins. He'll be answering questions at the end of the presentation, so hold on till then. You'll be able to do this in one of two ways. If you're feeling shy, post a chat message anytime up to and including question time and address the question to everybody. When the time comes, I'll read your question using your first name or the handle that's comes from your computer. Or you can wait and put your hand up during question time and I'll invite you to ask your question verbally. Michael's happy to have the screens on, but remember everyone can also see you, and please make sure your microphones are switched off. By now you should be on speaker view, and I now invite Michael to speak.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Brent. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. And I'm so glad so many of you have found the time to join me in this talk, essentially about the Coastwatchers. This is my 11th book. Not all the books I've written have been on the Second World War, but it has been my enduring interest in life. And I never expected to write a book about the Coastwatchers, but following three books I did, I wanted to follow a year, the momentous year of early 1942 to early 1943 in Australia's history, beginning with the Japanese threat to the north and ending with the Battle of the Bismarck Sea in early 1943, which was kind of closed a chapter in the Japanese threat to Australia up to a point. Happy to take that on notice as an argument, but I think that's what I more or less believe. I didn't expect to write a book about the Coastwatchers. I didn't know much about the Coastwatchers, and of all the books that I've done, the learning curve in researching this has never been so great, in that there was what I knew about Australia's Coastwatchers at the beginning of researching, and what I ended up knowing far exceeded any other topic that I'd tackled. What I found out was I started to uncover a story of what has been described variously as one of the most efficient spy rings in history. A huge comment, I know, but when you actually sum up what this ragtag little army of civilians, essentially civilians, did, it's quite astonishing. Giving ears and eyes to the enemy's progress, their dispositions, in circumstances that otherwise would have completely eluded the Allied forces operating in that very, very wild and untrammeled part of the world, particularly back then, the Pacific Ocean, and during the Pacific War, a battlefield sort of at the edge of the universe in many ways, at the end of everybody's supply lines, in a corner of the world, virtually uninhabited, unthought of previously, except for the people who, the smattering of people who lived there, unthought of even by our country in the years before the war, And before we get going, Jim Burrows, the last of the Coastwatchers, I'm so honoured to have you as a guest. So very good evening to you, and thanks so much for being here. Who were the Coastwatchers? Well, we have to go back to the First World War, in which it was realised that Australia's border was so porous, and so, I mean, it's porous and undefended and undefendable now, but back in 1418, German ships apparently just basically kind of decided to come down from places further afield and sail up and down the east and particularly the west coast of our continent, sort of thumbing their noses at what little defence or reconnaissance was there. This wasn't realised too much at the time, but after World War I, it was realised that this really can't go on. If we come to another more mechanised war, we're going to be in a lot of serious trouble. A report that came out in the early 1920s, when the nascent Naval Intelligence Service was established, estimated that, and I've got the quote in the book somewhere, and when I read this, I actually burst out laughing. It was about 2 in the morning when I was writing it. It was like something out of it was almost Python-esque, when the reporter said it's estimated that on most landing areas, possible landing areas of the West Australian coast, an enemy force of up to a division in strength could land unopposed, and it would be up to a month before anybody realized that they were there, which is ridiculous. And the naval intelligence realized it was ridiculous too, so they realized they had to do something about it. I'm cutting through a lot of personalities because I know our time is short to tell this enormous story, and I'll only really be able to touch on it. But it was reasoned that because the Australian defence in the interwar years basically had no money, and that was even before the Great Depression, it was decided very cleverly by the head of naval intelligence, a fellow called Cocky Long, Lieutenant Commander Long was his name, that we may as well utilise the people in situ on the northern coast of Australia and in our new possessions to our north. Now, I have to just pause here to just bring people up to speed. I'm sure you're a very erudite audience and you know this, but the Germans had a lot of territories to our north before the First World War. A big chunk of New Guinea, New Britain, you can see that map there. New Ireland was theirs, some parts of the Solomons, all of which, of course, were relinquished. I mean, think of HMAS Sydney in 1914, smashing up the Emden on the Cocos Islands. Well, that was all to do with Germany's imperial colonies flexing their muscles in the first few weeks of the war, and the Royal Australian Navy going up there and curtailing their ambitions, so to speak. The northern, you can see that that little line, that border line on the New Guinea Peninsula there. North of that was actually called Kaiser Wilhelm's Land by the Germans. And south of it was, well, first it was bizarrely an Australian colony. Queensland annexed it in the 1880s and then claimed it in the name of the British Empire. The British didn't actually want it and were very cross at the Queensland government to doing that. A premier did it to get votes for an election, can you believe? But then when the Germans moved in, it became a fait accompli, and the Brits took it over and then gave it back to us before World War I. So that was, and look, the names of New Guinea in this part of history is so confusing. The territories of Papua and New Guinea, then it was Papua / New Guinea. They were separate places, but after World War I, Australia had that southern bit and Germany lost everything. Billy Hughes went to Versailles at the end of the war and said, all right, well, all those German colonies to our north. Can we have them, please? And Versailles said, sure, whatever. What you'd want with them, we've got no idea, but you can have them. The other country, of course, putting up their hand for these German colonies was, of course, Japan, who had far more nefarious ambitions and what to do with them in their very long-term strategy of conquest that really, you can argue, began in the late 19th century. But we don't need to worry about that. But what it led to was an opening up suddenly of mandated Australian territories to our north, giving great opportunities for Australians to come up and have adventures, have jobs, have businesses, and some were very, very lucrative businesses, taking over the German coffee, copra and rubber plantations that all relinquished. A lot of Germans actually hung around and stayed there and were actually quite productive people during the interwar years, and because it was very lucrative. To administer and police these Australian territories, you needed essentially imperial territorial policemen, patrol officers, and there was a whole ranking system and a whole career structure for Australians and British to go up and basically rule these places. Fairly benignly, the relationship between the indigenous inhabitants of New Guinea and New Britain and the Solomon Islands was pretty good during the interwar years. Certainly these Australian industries brought a lot of wealth to an otherwise very, very poor part of the world, and relations were pretty good. What Cocky Long and naval intelligence decided to use was these very people and compel them, compel is the wrong word, but ask them to volunteer, because there was no payment involved, to simply join an organization appropriately called the Coastwatcher service to basically keep an eye on things. If a strange ship turned up in, say, Talasea there on New Britain, if some strange people arrived in Rabaul, if some people turned up, or some ships, or then towards the 1920s and 30s, aeroplanes turned up, they simply reported it, often by of writing a letter, can you believe, to Melbourne, and then by the telegraph system and the shortwave radio service. So gradually and slowly and fairly peaceably, a couple of hundred of these Australian and British settlers were incorporated on a completely volunteer basis into this system called the Coastwatchers. And it kind of ticked along. Nothing was particularly revealed of any great import until getting towards the beginning of the war, when it was suddenly realized in Melbourne and Canberra that Japan would, in all likelihood, come into its conflict in our area. Nobody knew when, and certainly nobody knew in what kind of force. A great urgency then went through the Coastwatcher system. We have this system in place. We have to reinforce it. It's a very patchy system. It doesn't really work properly. It's a bit haphazard. We need someone to actually bring these people together. And before we get to the picture of the radio, Jason or Brent, can we just get to the photo of Eric Felt, if you have it there? Here we are, Commander Eric Felt, O-B-E-R-A-N. He was the man that was selected, an ex-World War I naval veteran. He didn't do much in World War I, but as soon as the war ended, he headed his way to make his fortune in Bougainville and New Guinea. He became a patrol officer. He settled up there, had a very happy life. He was the man who actually was part of the first naval intake of officers in 1912 with Cocky Long, the head of naval intelligence, and Long said, he's the man I want. Just before World War II, Felt put himself back, he took himself off the retired list and put himself back on the reserve list. And when that came across Long's desk, he slapped the table and said, that's the man I need to head up this intelligence service. He happened to be in Brisbane on leave. A plane was sent up to actually basically compel him to come down to Melbourne, where Long said, mate, I'm sorry about this. I'm sorry to drag you away from your holiday, but I've got to send you back to New Guinea because I need you to head up a nascent security service that it's the only thing we have, keeping an eye on what is going to happen to our north. And Felt immediately said, I'm your man. When do I start? Well, tomorrow was the answer. World War II, the end of September 1939 came along, and an increasing urgency came into the Coastwatcher service. Felt then, in the first few weeks of 1940, he went on this extraordinary adventure. Can we go back to the Pacific map that we had there, Brent, if that's okay? Thank you, mate. He went through this extraordinary adventure, starting off at, I think he was flown up to Moresby, then went to Lae, then went over to Rabaul, the old capital of New Britain. We'll be hearing more about Rabaul and New Britain later. From then, on Rabaul and New Ireland, and there's Caviang there, the major town on New Ireland, then over to Buke and Beauville, he scoured by every means he could. He bribed a fisherman, he paid a pilot, he hitchhiked literally all across these islands, and they all knew him. So he was at a great advantage, and all the natives loved him. He was a very popular man. He was a very decent fellow, and he'd proved his mettle in the 1930s of being able to handle the tropics. And he began to sign up as many people as he could to the Coastwatcher service. Their weapon of choice then began, and can we go back to the radio? I apologize for jumping around. Here he is. This was the Coastwatcher's primary means of communication, the AWA 3B teleradio, and isn't it a beauty? It's been described as being the weight and dimensions of a small family car, and it had to be carried uphill, down dale, through jungles, across leads, across mountains. It broke down into 3 or 4 boxes. One's a receiver, one's a transmitter, the other one looks like the microphone. That's not half of it. There's also a motor, a petrol-driven motor to charge the batteries, which were basically 2 car batteries, plus a huge metal microphone and a 30-foot-long steel aerial, which had to be extended to its full extent before the bloody thing would work. But work it did, and it was the best we had at the time, an Australian-made invention, invented and produced by Amalgamated Wireless Australasia, AWA, and they churned them out in their hundreds. There's a Morse code key there. Yeah, I just saw it. It could throw a signal, I think it was 400 miles just by voice and 600 by Morse. It was brilliant. This machine, as cumbersome as it was 80 years ago, this thing saved countless lives, countless lives. It was robust. It was sealed on the inside to keep away the moisture of the tropics. God knows how it worked. And native bearers, which we'll talk about, because none of the Coastwatchers could have survived a week without an army of loyal and devoted and absolutely blessed native people from New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. This is what they started to be issued with when the war came. Okay. By August 1941, everyone thought that Japan, well, some people in intelligence thought that Japan had missed its mark, that they weren't going to attack the Pacific, and but then, of course, December 1941 and the great 100-day blitz, which apparently is one of the greatest advances in military history ever. People think that Japan just attacked Pearl Harbor, where it was Hong Kong and Malaya. They organized coups in Thailand and Indochina and all these sorts of places, and started to pour down towards our north. The first port of call closest to this country is this place, New Britain, a 600-mile wide island, banana-shaped roughly, with that place, Rabaul. You can just see it in the top right-hand corner, a magnificent natural harbour, which the Germans had established, a beautiful, thank you for putting the pointer there, mate, very nicely done, a beautiful natural harbour. This is the first place that the Japanese really made landfall in their conquest of the south part of the Southwest Pacific. Many of you will know the story, the poor old buggers of Lark Force, the militia fellows, of course, being an Australian territory, you could be actually drafted to serve in Australian mandated territories because, of course, as you know, the AIF are all volunteers, but they were on the other side of the world in Africa, fighting the Italians and the Free French and the Germans. All we had was our militia fellows, boys from the suburbs of Melbourne and Adelaide and Hobart, sent into this completely alien landscape of this tropical town of Rabaul to defend the Japanese. Great. They had absolutely no hope, mainly because of our own dreadful incompetence. Lark Force arrived, I think, in the early months of 1941. Not only did they not explore the jungle around them, that island is basically all jungle, native villages, plantations, crisscrossed with native tracks, very fertile, but you've not got to know how to live on it. Not only were these boys were not introduced to the jungle, they were forbidden to even go there by one of the most incompetent Australian commanders of this or any other war, a man called Scanlon, who was a World War I hero in the trenches, but he was way out of his depth when given the command of Lark Force. He had no idea what he was doing. He thought he was fighting the last war. Well, he wasn't. Cut to the chase when I think in February, sorry, it was January 23, the invasion of Rabaul, 3,500, I think, top Japanese troops, overwhelmed with this one single battalion of ill-trained and ill-equipped and ignorant Australian soldiers. Not their fault, they're ignorant, their commander's fault, and they were basically scattered into the jungle. The first great test of the Coastwatchers was New Britain in the early days of 1942. A fellow called Keith McCarthy, he was a district officer in this part of the world. He was on the other side of the island when Rabaul fell in about 35 minutes, scattering virtually in 2 blocks the 450 times 2 men of Lark Force. One group sort of fled to the north, the other fled to the south. A couple ended up down at Wide Bay. The others were basically collected by this fellow called Keith McCarthy, who Eric Felt described, who was a Coastwatcher patrol officer in this on this island. He'd been there for several years. He was actually Irish. Felt described him, I think, something like a short, red-headed Irishman with the temperament of a short, red-headed Irishman, and thank goodness he did, because he took it upon himself to basically Pied Piper-like round up as many of these men that he could find. And they were scattered everywhere, in panic, in desperation, starving, surrounded by native gardens full of taro and all sorts of things to eat, but they had no idea how to do it. So they were wasting away, improper malarial treatment, no jungle training. They basically panicked and ran to God knows where. Keith McCarthy and his native policemen and loyal followers rounded up these men, as many as they could find, and shepherded them away from the Japanese in Rabaul along that northern coast of New Britain in the first few months of 1942. It was an ordeal that I don't know. If we were Americans, ladies and gentlemen, this is the sort of thing that we'd have on our stamps. I'm very grateful we're not Americans, by the way, don't get me wrong. But this is the sort of story that for some reason has been forgotten by us. Partially that's the government of the time's fault. They were very embarrassed about what happened to Lark Force. They basically wrote them off. They knew the Japanese were going to come to this place. Why wouldn't they? A beautiful natural harbour, which they then used extensively for the next 2 or 3 years, having routed the pitiful Australian force. But this force was, all they could do was basically flee. Thank God for Keith McCarthy, who basically progressed as best he could from places, from staging camp to staging camp, hoping to get away from the Japanese to the other side of the island. By March, though, he was desperate. Food was running out. He'd relied as best as he could on plantation owners that he knew. There were lots and lots of them along this northern coast, great for rubber, great for copra, some coffee, that sort of thing was being grown. He'd exhausted his largesse with his friends and was trying to, and he had one of those AWA radios with him, trying to communicate with Moors. We say, what do I do with these men? Can you send a plane? Oh, no, much too precious, can't send a plane. Can you send some ships? No, haven't got any ships to spare. Well, what do you expect me to do? And they said, well, can you believe they actually said, well, look, go to Cape Gloucester, that's on the other side of the island, and try and get a boat across, and then walk across, when you get to the New Guinea mainland at Lae, walk across the top bit and we'll pick you up somewhere. And apparently, this is in March 1942, McCarthy basically threw the receiver down and went into despair. About this time, I'll draw your attention to the Vitu. Can your little arrow pick up the Vitu Islands there? Thanks, mate. There was a particular, well, no, I'll jump to these, one group of these starving men who were at one of the plantations, and I've noted it here, Polo, I think it was called, a plantation on the northern coast. At the bottom of that Willamite's Peninsula there, in that little nook down there, they were resting there, thank you. One day, one afternoon, because they were all exhausted and malaria-ridden and despairing and starving and diseased, they looked up and saw a sailboat coming towards them. The sailboat ran up to the shore and outstepped a woman, a rather beautiful woman in her 30s, immaculately dressed in a 1940s slacks and blouse, and started walking up the beach. Literally, the men thought they had died and gone to heaven. They thought it was like the angel of Mons walking up the beach towards her. This confident young woman looked around and said, who's in charge here? And someone vaguely pointed over to poor bedraggled Keith McCarthy over there, despairing, having lost 4 stone of his body weight, and sees this beautiful woman walking towards him. And he, I don't know what he thinks, but she says, hello, my name's Gladys. I live on that island over there. 80 miles away is Vitu Islands. And Gladys was the widow of a very successful plantation manager. She'd been there since 1932. With her radio, she'd picked up the disaster of Rabaul, and she was a trained nurse, expert in tropical diseases, a midwife, a superb sailor, a superb navigator, a superb shot with a rifle, and she took it upon herself to go over and offer her assistance, because she was able to reveal to them, where she asked Keith, what are your plans? He said, well, I don't have any plans. I've got these 400 men who are all going to die unless I get them off this island. Because sooner or later, the Japs will catch up with us, and I've got hardly any food to give them anyway, and they're all desperate. And she said, well, I have a 350-ton ship over at my place. Why don't you get over there and you can have it? Some small boats had come over. I can't go into that story. A tiny little flotilla of 20 small boats had come over from Lae to assist and follow the men along their odyssey a bit. They ferried them over to Gladys Baker's property over on Vitu. They boarded this ship that had just a few weeks before had happened to come into her harbour to pick up a load of copra, but the captain was too scared of being bombed by the Japanese, so he was basically hiding under the palm trees, to Gladys Baker's disgust. But lucky he did, because he said to Keith McCarthy went over and said, I'm taking over this ship, ferried the men over. They boarded the Lakatoy, as this ship was called. It was only a 4-year-old Burns-Philp steamer built in Hong Kong, superbly seaworthy, almost brand new. And they boarded that and sailed not only to Lae, they sailed all the way to Cairns and arrived in Cairns. This 450 or so bedraggled men of Lark 4 sailed into Cairns Harbour. Unannounced, the harbour master went up to this ship and said, who on earth are you? And they said, well, and where have you come from? And apparently some wag, as they came down the gangway, said, oh yes, we've just come from Army Headquarters, St Kilda Barracks, Melbourne. They formed up in the middle of Cairns, and the word went out, there's some soldiers have arrived, let's go and greet them. And everyone went silent, seeing these barely dressed men in their state of desperation marching down. None of them, from almost none of them, ever served again. They were shot. they'd shot their bolt. They had been abandoned by their own country, but not by Keith McCarthy, Coastwatcher, and Gladys Baker, one of the not quite a coast watcher, but she was essentially an assistant, and I include her in the Coast Watcher service. It was often it could be a fairly loose organization. People later in the war tended to come and go without officially putting their names down. That was one of the first big tests. Immediately, the Coast Watchers started to fall foul of the Japanese on a couple of little islands. As the Japanese advanced, there was one Coast Watcher, Colin Payne, I think his name was, announced over the radio on his tiny little one-man Coast Watcher spot, unfamiliar vessel entering harbour, and that was the last he was ever seen. I think he was on a little island called Nissan, strung right out there. He was never heard of again. He was one of the first Coast Watchers to be executed by the Japanese. Moving on, all I can do in this talk is give some of the more salient stories. I want to talk about Lee Vile now. I might be jumping around, but we talk about Lee Vile. Lee Vile was another, there he is, flight lieutenant. He was only flight lieutenant because they made him one so he could join the Coast Watcher service. He was a patrol officer in Rabaul before the war. Just got out. He knew what was happening. He managed to sneak out 150 RAAF personnel right under the noses of the Japanese as they were coming into the harbour and spirit them away on a boat over to Port Moresby. He then he managed to catch a flight down to Cairns, where he walked straight into Eric Felt's office and said, "I want to be a Coast Watcher. Send me back there. I know the area. You'd be mad if you didn't use my services." So Eric Felt, the head of the Coast Watchers, who'd never heard of this fellow before, said, "Okay, you're my man." He was sent straight back to Port Moresby, just in time for the Japanese air offensive prior to the Great Kokoda struggle started to get underway. They were coming over initially from Rabaul, and Lee Vile, who was a short man, he was a slight man. He was from Melbourne, from a well-to-do family in Camberwell. He was studying commerce at Melbourne University, and for some reason that nobody's ever been able to establish, he chucked it all in, and in the late 1920s or early 30s, applied to be a patrol officer in New Guinea, and was accepted as one of 20 of 1,600 applicants, and went up there. And one of these people that completely adapted to the tropics instantly. God knows how. I'm having to go to Darwin quite a bit at the moment, and it's kind of exhausting. How they do it, I don't know. But he loved the tropics, and he wrote articles for Walkabout and Outlander travel magazines during the 20s and 30s about these wonderful places. He was a highly intelligent man, a bit of a loner, but he was deposited to keep an eye on the northern coast of New Guinea. He was deposited near Salamaua and Lae. I think on the 20th of February, he began his stint, and only had to wait till the 8th of March till he witnessed Japanese ships pulling up off the town of Salamaua on the northern New Guinean coast, and that was the invasion. That was the first invasion, the first Japanese soldiers stepping foot on the northern coast of New Guinea to begin their great campaign to try and take Moresby. Then, of course, aircraft were taking off from the rudimentary airfields at Lae and Salamaua, particularly, I think there was a strip on both of those places. They're quite close together on the northern New Guinea coastline. Lee Vile was in a tree, basically a tree house, all alone with his teleradio, living off taro, the occasional couscous that he caught and cooked, a handful of rice. 9 times a day, he would fire up his teleradio radio and give the eyes and ears of what was happening beyond the eyes and ears of the Air Force base around. It couldn't hang over, and all this would be plotted in a cave at 12 Mile Strip, 12 miles out of Moresby, by the intelligence officers, who suddenly could get eyes and ears on what the Japanese air activity was doing. When he could, he gave warnings of air attacks to get the 75 Squadron, who just turned up, Kitty Hawks, up as best as they could to take on the Japanese Zeros, which was a very difficult thing to do. But at least if you had a bit of height, you could make some impact on them, and they particularly made impact on the Japanese bombers coming over. Levi was an extraordinary man. For I think a couple of months he stayed out there. His health started to deteriorate. Tinea, he was crippled by tinea to the extent that he could barely walk. He had to crawl. He then decided to relocate, not further away from the Japanese, but closer to them, because sometimes his mountain would get clouded out. So he came down the mountain till he was something like 2 kilometers from the Japanese airstrip at Salamaua. He could read the serial numbers on the Zero aircraft taking off. I don't think it was big enough for the bombers. I think the escorting Zeros took off from those ones. The bombers, with their range, came over from further north. The Japanese direction finding equipment could pick up that there was a signal coming, but they could not pinpoint him. At various occasions, the myriad patrols sent out to find him literally walked under his tree. He apparently recounted the smell of Japanese tobacco wafting up as they walked through the jungle under his tree house, held his breath. Of course, there was, he knew exactly what his fate was if he was to be captured, tortured and executed in very short order, supported again by his native friends, the New Guineans, upon whom he relied absolutely. Levi was barely recognized really by the Australians. The DSC that he was awarded it's the American Distinguished Service Cross, not the Commonwealth Distinguished Service Cross. I think that's correct, because the Americans thought he was absolutely marvelous. The Australians, oh yeah, he's there doing his job, which was really the kind of tenure of what our commanders in the Pacific thought of our people. As a sidebar here, I've done a lot of research into the RAAF during the war. It was almost impossible for an Australian airman in the Pacific to pick up a decoration. The Royal Air Force, through DFMs and DFCs and DSOs at our airmen over there fighting the Germans, but we, for our airmen fighting, probably goes for the army too. Bill Sherlock, the young captain who saved the Battle of Wau around this time, he should have got a VC, posthumous VC. He got nothing. Anyway, I sidetrack. Levi was awarded the DSA not by us but by the Americans. Tragically, he realized that he had to come down the tree and to come back to Moresby, not because he didn't want to keep doing his work, but his radio crystals and valves couldn't work anymore, and the set was falling to pieces. And they wouldn't let him go back. Said, Lee, you've done your job. Thank you very much. Tragically, he was killed in an air crash in a Liberator, one of the many aircraft that crashed into those very dangerous mountains in 1944. Such a sad story, such and a wonderful coast watcher, the Golden Voice, Lee Veitch. Now, I've been contacted over the past couple of days by Lee Veitch's granddaughter, who may be listening. If she is, hi, and let's have a chat after the show. I need to talk about, on the time here, oh goodness me, only 20 minutes to go. I'll talk about two of the most famous coast watchers and the significance of what they did over on the Great Big Island. Sorry, mate, bring up the map again, could you, the big one? Yeah, over on Bougainville. There it is, slap bang in the middle of the screen. It's a very, see, just look at the scale there. That's 300 miles. That's, I mean, it's a very big place. Bougainville was incredibly important to the Japanese, providing the link between their conquest of the northern New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Coastwatchers were deposited, two in particular, a fellow called Jack Reed and a fellow called Paul Mason on Bougainville. They didn't know each other much at the beginning of the war. They were both patrol officers. Paul Mason was one of those unlikely heroes of the war. He was a short, bespectacled, he had suffered from, there's a pic of him somewhere. I'm sorry to make you clear. There he is. Thanks, mate. Paul Mason, not the most heroic looking figure. He had a kind of his vocal cords had been affected by various bouts of malaria. He had very thick glasses, and he had a fairly abrupt manner. And he'd been up in the islands for years running a copper plantation called, what was it called? Oh, I can't remember now. Oh, that's irrelevant. I've noted it here. Langu, maybe it was Langu. Can't remember. But he was, when the war came, he had already been enrolled into the Coastwatcher service, and his station was slap bang in the middle of the northern part of Bougainville, and he kept an eye on things there. Moving forward to June 1942, and the Americans, who are really only just getting their trainer wheels on in the Pacific at this stage, realized they had to get their they had to take their trainer wheels off in an almighty hurry, because the Japanese, they discovered, were building an airstrip that they did not want the Japanese to have, because it would have been very, very dicey if they had. That was, of course, on an otherwise obscure chunk of tropical island in the Solomons called Guadalcanal. Nobody even heard of the place, but there we are, Guadalcanal. Honiara was only a village at that stage, and that is just where it was actually called Luca, I think. I'm forgetting the names. Just there was a little beach there. That's where the Japanese, a couple of months earlier, had decided to land and bring bulldozers ashore and start constructing an airstrip. The Coastwatchers on that, a fellow called Martin Clemens, he was watching out what was happening on Guadalcanal, and he was reporting the progress of this Japanese airstrip, and was saying, look, they're nearly about to put planes on it. It's going very well. They're nearly finished it. And it wasn't until June that year that the Americans finally realized, we've got to stop this Japanese building it and perhaps pinch it ourselves, which is exactly what they did, landing in the first few days of 1942. I think it was the Marines, or was it the Big Red One? Military historians amongst them might be able to correct there. I think it was the Marines, actually, landed on Guadalcanal towards at the Japanese airstrip. He fired up his radio and sent to Port Moresby, giving his coordinates of himself and the direction of the aircraft. He sent out the following message, one of the most important verbal messages of intelligence of the entire Pacific War, simply, quote, 24 bombers heading yours. That's all he said. That message was picked up instantly in Port Moresby, thrown to Townsville, thrown to Canberra, thrown by shortwave to Pearl Harbor, the US Naval Base Pearl Harbor. They then disseminated it back to the landing force, current fighters who had only just taken off on a standing patrol from the USS Wasp, were ordered to come down, refuel, rearm, wait a bit, and then were sent up to their top altitude, about 32,000 feet. An hour and a half later, the Japanese Val dive bombers turned up expecting, and I can't actually remember how they had discovered that the Americans were landing there, but they had, expecting to surprise the Americans and blast them on the beaches as their ships were anchored and immovable, sitting ducks. Well, the tide was turned on them because of Paul Mason's message. One of the most absolutely influential piece of intelligence affecting a battle in real time, in a real way, was disseminated and brought to bear on this incredibly crucial. One is there see as a, well, it's a naval medal, but it's a sort of a silver polished thing, which looks different to that. Paul Mason on Bougainville for the entire war, crisscrossing the island several times. He was taken off the island, then brought back. Later in the war, he led a kind of a guerrilla campaign against the Japanese, arming them. Up to this point, Eric Felt, the Coastwatchers leader, had determined that the Coastwatchers were not to be armed. They were to be completely passive. And a famous Coastwatcher described the Coastwatchers thus: a Coastwatcher's work is to sit in hiding like a spider, right in the web of the enemy, unseen and unheard. We became the eyes and ears of the Pacific. Jack Reed was Paul Mason's mate on, is there a picture of Jack there? Yeah, Jack Reed. He's the physical opposite to Paul Mason. Handsome, matinee idol. That guy could be a bloody movie star, couldn't he? Well, he was a patrol officer also in the Second World War, operating on Bougainville. He did some extraordinary things too. One of the most remarkable things he did was organize the evacuation of a lot of people that should have got off a lot earlier, but also a particular people like nuns. Like there was an order of nuns, American nuns, who had been there administering God's work before the war, and they were told to evacuate, but they thought very foolishly, oh, don't worry, we're way above the you know, the kind of petty politics and of men and man. We'll stay here. And apparently one of the sisters on the island wrote in her diary, looking forward to be able to source their bicycle inner tube tires directly from Tokyo rather than have to go through Port Moresby in Canberra. Well, sister, that they were a rude awakening when the Japanese, who I should add all this time were becoming more and more aware of the Coastwatchers' presence, but couldn't find them, or rarely could they find them. The Coastwatchers were very good at disappearing into the jungle. The Japanese sent out patrols to try and find them. Contrary to a lot of myths, and I'll happily debate this with people, the Japanese weren't actually very good in the jungle. They were in the jungle and they were good at hiding in the jungle. Their concealment was brilliant, but they were as untrained and unsuited to the jungle as we were. Japan is not a jungle country. They hadn't had any training in it. And their tactics in jungle warfare were pretty primitive. It was still the kind of en masse charge, kill everything you can. And if plan A fails, well, guess what, boys? There's no plan B. They hated the jungle even more than the Allied soldiers. The letters sent home by Japanese troops detested being there, particularly New Guinea. New Guinea was the place from which nobody thought they were ever coming back, and they were largely right, as we know. So when the Japanese sent out these patrols to find the Coastwatchers, they weren't very good at it. They weren't thorough. If they found that they'd just missed their quarry by a few minutes, they'd rarely pursue them. They just want to go back and have rice and sake back at base. They hated being there. They seem a miserable lot, actually, the Japanese army of the Pacific of the Second World War, but I'd be happily be informed by someone who knows more about their topic than I do. I digress. Jack Reed managed to elude the Japanese until mid-1943. Again, as all coast watchers, giving daily reports on Japanese dispositions, ship movements, troop movements, native spies, armies of native spies were working for the Japanese, who would spirit away and report back to the coast watchers, who then would give this information to the Allies, what the Japanese were doing, what their ranking system was, what their supplies were like, what their morale was like. We had incredible intel into the Japanese occupation forces of these islands, thanks largely to the coast watchers. An odd back to the Sisters of New York, who had been in this part of the world for years. They suddenly realized they had to get out when the Japanese started basically executing any Europeans that they could find. They let them hang there for a year or so when they first got there, thinking, well, what are they going to do? But then when the coast watchers started buggering up their plans, they thought all the Europeans were against them and they were out to basically kill them. Didn't matter who they were. You may notice these fellas, these pictures, all these fellas are in naval uniform, and Levi was in an Air Force uniform. They weren't naval officers, they were essentially civilians. What happened though, is that they had to bring them, well, the Coast Watchers brought them nominally into the Australian Armed Services because they thought if they were captured, the Japanese would treat them better if they were officers. Well, they soon realized that the Japanese were equal opportunity barbarians and didn't care if you're a private civilian, man, woman, child, whatever, they were equally awful to you. So it didn't really matter. That's why they're in naval uniform. The nuns, he got word of the fact that there was this 20 or so nuns in a convent or a seminary in the middle of the island, and the Japanese had them prisoner and were going to execute them. So he had a kind of a raiding party to come and spirit them away. His native bearers literally carrying some of these elderly ladies over the mountain tracks to a spot on the northwest. Can we bring up a map of, I don't know if we have one, I should have put one in, of Bougainville. Is there a map of Bougainville there, Brent? I'll just see if there's one there. No, it doesn't matter. A beach called Tiola Beach, and he corralled these, again, it was a kind of a Pied Piper, matching Keith McCarthy's effort with the soldiers, but it ended up being about 160 odd bod civilians, Teop Harbour and the northwestern corner of Bougainville. And there are a couple of occasions where the submarine, if there's a picture of the submarine there, that would be great. I think it's the USS, the Guardfish. The Guardfish was sent to pick up these people. The captain of the Guardfish, God bless him, thought 40 people were about to crowd onto his sub. It ended up being like 160. I don't know how it could surface again once he dived, but he got them away. We're running out of time, so I am going to skip to, oh yes, I'll just very quickly, one of the most famous Coastwatcher stories, and you probably know it, but it involves the PT boats, the American PT boats, that were basically actually pretty bloody awful. We all watched McHale's Navy as a kid. Well, oh, you've given the game away. Don't worry. But Reg Evans, here we are, the man who rescued John F. Kennedy, the young JFK, because he was a PT boat captain in August 1942, operating out of a base at New Georgia. The PT boats were pretty hopeless. They were made of timber, very porous to shrapnel and bullets. The German E-boats were brilliant. They were made of steel and had diesel engines. The American E-boats were fast, but they had very temperamental petrol aeroplane engines in for some reason. No radios, bad communication. They were hopeless at night. They sent out, they didn't bloody hit a thing. And this is when the Japanese were reinforcing Guadalcanal down what they call the slot, down the Tokyo Express, reinforcing their soldiers on Guadalcanal by night. Kennedy was in a fleet of about 21 PT boats that went out in 1 August to try and interdict the Japanese destroyers heading south. Well, not only did he not interdict anything, they all fired off their torpedoes, hit nothing, and basically Kennedy didn't know where he was and idled his engines, not wanting to waste fuel. And suddenly one of his mates called out, "Ship!" And a few seconds later, he was cut in half. The ship was sawed in half by a Japanese destroyer whose name I've forgotten. 2 of his crew of 13 were lost instantly. Kennedy corralled his men onto the floating bow of the boat. Eventually, it drifted onto a tiny little bit of sand. The Americans didn't even know they were there for a few days. Reg Evans, that mild-mannered looking former accountant from Sydney, was on a very steep volcano island, not about 6 or 7 miles from the night action. He saw gunfire and explosions in the water, radioed the next day that I think I saw some action last night. The Americans didn't really respond to it, but just in case, he sent out some of his native scouts to scour the area. About 5 days later, he found them. He found these poor, bedraggled American sailors living off coconut juice, all sunburnt, all pretty desperate, led by young Lieutenant John F. Kennedy, who had badly injured his back in the crash, which of course plagued him for the rest of his life, which led to dreadful barbiturate use, which led to a lot of other problems in his life. Nothing to do with his terrible demise, though, of course. JFK was literally rescued by that man to his right there. Reg Evans and JFK only met briefly. JFK was then spirited away, then went into politics. Reg went back to being an accountant in Sydney after the war, and just out of politeness. Kennedy had no idea who he was rescued by. Just out of politeness, Evans wrote a letter to the White House that was picked up by Kennedy. And Kennedy then, to his credit, flew Reg over and greeted him there in the Oval Office of the White House. And what a treat it would have been for the old, not too old boy. But there you go. Well, look, we're out of time. I just want to say that it was an astonishing story researching the Coastwatchers. There are so many more anecdotes that even in the book I couldn't get to. There just wasn't enough space. After the war, the Coastwatchers, we'll get to that picture in a bit. After the war, the Coastwatchers weren't particularly celebrated. There were memorials for them. A memorial put up in Papua somewhere that not many people attended. A lot of the islanders went back. The wonderful Gladys Baker, who helped rescue the fellows on New Britain, she went back to her plantation on Vitu and sadly only lasted another year before succumbing to the dreadful black water fever, a complication of malaria. On their way back, both Jack Reed and Paul Mason were flown via Honiara, which was a big naval base, on their way back. And their aeroplane was forcibly detained by the US Navy, and they were ushered into an office. They had no idea why. They thought they were in trouble. And the neighbor said, "Oh, can you gentlemen just wait here?" A door opens. Chester Nimitz walks in, the commander of the Pacific Fleet in the Pacific. Both those two men stand to attention. Nimitz says, "Mr. Mason, Mr. Reed, please sit down. When I'm in a room with you, I'm the one that does the standing," which till to this day brings a lump to my throat when I hear it. And at least the Americans recognize the brilliant work the Coastwatchers did. Look, we're out of time. I'm sorry, gentlemen, it's bang on 8, but if you wanted some comments or some observations, even corrections, I'm always open to be corrected by you learned ladies and gentlemen, no problem there, or observations. I've got a couple, but I'll hand back to Jason and Brent, please, but we can continue the discussion. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Michael. That was tremendous. And I really wish we had another hour for you to, I'm sure you'd fill an hour up very easily. It was tremendous. There's a couple of chat comments mainly rather than.
Oh yes, they're brilliant. Peter, 8th Division, provided the 3. Yes, that's right. Lark, Sparrow, and one Lark and Sparrow Force and
Goal Force.
Goal. Thank you very much. The 23rd, the militia battalions were largely used as garrison for Port Moresby. Absolutely, yes, yes, very well observed, Peter. That's completely true. And honestly, I feel so sorry for them. I'm being dubbed the chocolate soldiers, the chocos. Terrible, really, because they did such incredible work. I mean, I wouldn't have lasted 10 minutes in that bloody jungle, and these untrained, virtually untrained fellows were there for ages. Graham, my father was part of Sparrow Force on Timor, 2nd 40th, 2nd IF, arrived on Timor December 41. Timor had great ongoing actions against the Japanese for a couple of years. And thanks for your comment, Marcus. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
So does anyone have any questions, other questions, or any questions they want to ask Michael?
Yeah. Andrew McKinnon, can you hear me?
Hi, Andrew.
Hi. Michael, I'd just like to correct one thing. I do believe that Jim Burrows is not the last of the Coastwatchers.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
We have another one, Ronald Dixie Lee, who, with Burrows, their representatives or their offspring, met with Ambassador Kennedy at the War Memorial last year, who acknowledged the role of the Coastwatchers during the Second World War. And Ronald Dixie Lee was a Coastwatcher from about 1943, 44, right through to the end of the war in Solomons, Bougainville and mainland PNG. And he's still with us, 98 years old, hale and hearty, and came to our Historical Society
Is
event.
Jim with us tonight?
Don't know.
I think he is. I can see a Jim there. Hello, Jim. If you're there, I can see a Jim, but his camera's turned off. John, please give us a few sentences on Peter Ryan, Fear Drive My Feet. John, my absolute pleasure to do that. If anybody wants to read a book about what it was like to have to traipse through the jungles of New Guinea, Peter Ryan's Fear Drive My Feet is an absolute classic. It is a beautiful book. I think Peter was a journalist. You can correct me on this, John. I met Peter only once when I was helping the ABC present an Anzac Day commentary, and I got him to sign an early edition of Fear Drive My Feet. Peter Ryan was a patrol officer. And was he a Coastwatcher? Well, he was from the same pool of what the Coastwatchers were drawn from. Whether he was a Coastwatcher himself, I'm not sure. But it is a great read if anybody hasn't read it. And he was a true gentleman too.
Any more? I don't think Jim's going to say anything. I think he might have gone. Raman, can you?
Just Michael, thank you very much.
Thank you, mate. Thank you.
It's fantastic presentation. Raman is from 6th RAR representative, 6th Royal Australian Regiment.
Oh, hello.
Yes. This is my second interaction with you. We did one in the Battle of Bismarck Sea during the pandemics, and when you launched.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I still waiting for your autograph in the books. If I board in the two of them, is there any way I can have your autograph?
Yes, of course. Just contact me via I'll just get my email from the gentleman, and we'll work it out that way. Where do you live?
In Mitcham.
Mitcham. Oh, we can work something out. Yeah.
All right.
Send me an email, and yes, fine.
That'll be great. And the Sparrow Force you mentioned in Timor, between the East Timor and West Timor, our patrol base is called the Sparrow. It was fantastic in the time nearly about 2 months, and watching what's going on in the other side of the in the border, which is Atambua. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Just wondering what's happening to Gladys Baker.
Well, Gladys came back. She navigated the ship because she was the Lakatoy, the ship that brought off a couple hundred blokes from Lark Force, didn't have proper charts. Not proper charts to get down to Cairns. She navigated through the reefs, which she knew. She came ashore with the fellows at Cairns. All she took with her was a housemaid who she didn't want to leave to the Japanese, and her little dog. Can you believe the bloody Australian customs took her dog and destroyed her dog because it wasn't in quarantine? Awful. After all that, she then joined. She was given a rank, honorary rank of a lieutenant, I think, and she was part of intelligence in Townsville. And she wanted to join the commandos, but they wouldn't let her because she was a female. And as I said, she went back as soon as the war ended to rebuild her plantation, but died of malaria a year later. Very, very sad.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Are there any more questions? I think Marcus Fielding would like you to give a synopsis of your book about the Battle of the Bismarck Sea.
Oh, Lord. Okay. All right.
A couple of sentences.
And Tanya, thank you.
Hi, Michael. It's Tanya here.
Tanya is the granddaughter of Lee Vile. Is that correct?
It is. And my mother is Lindy, the lovely lady that you see.
Oh, hello, Lindy.
There's,
thank you,
that
lady.
is my mother, her father.
Oh, Lee Vile was your father.
Mum, come off, come off.
Turn your...
That's
Yes, yes, he was.
Okay.
And Tanya and I have been doing a lot of work with his diaries that he wrote while he was coast watching.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Is there anything you can add? I mean, firstly, did I get his story roughly correct?
Absolutely. And we're so grateful that you spent so long on it and we're obviously, you know, in admiration of him. Thank you very much indeed for that. We really appreciate it. The book's wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Taught me so much about, particularly about the Solomons that I had known nothing about, and Paul Mason and Jack Reed. It's a wonderful book.
Oh, thank you. Look, am I correct in assuming that he was awarded the American Distinguished Service
Yes,
Cross?
yes. No recognition from Australia at all.
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. It really is terrible. What made him, do you know, I'm fascinated to talk to you. What, do you know what, because your family, you're Melburnians, aren't you,
Yes,
Lucy? So do you know what made him travel to?
I do. He was an outdoor person, very much so. He was a skier at university, mountaineering. Even though he did accountancy and his job was accountancy, he yearned for nature and adventure. And it's his eldest daughter, my older sister, is the same again. She does incredible adventurous things, and it's all because of Lee. He just was adventure personified.
And goodness, I can see that you're a chip off the old block. That's the same face as in that photograph. Do you know where that photograph was taken? It's the most famous photo of Lee.
Yes, there are not so many photos of him. No, I don't know. And none of them are particularly pleasing, you know.
Complimentary, shall you say, Mum?
Yeah.
I've got
Yes,
one
yes,
behind
no.
me. I've got one behind me, which I think is the only engagement photo we're ever going to see of my mother, of my grandmother and my grandfather.
Oh,
Yes,
okay.
that's right.
Okay.
Anyway, thank you, Michael. Thank you so much.
No worries, Lindy. And yes, we are all very, very blessed by you and your daughter's presence. Real Australian military Coastwatcher royalty we're in the presence of. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
Great.
There's just one other comment here from John Davies. Says, in addition to thanks, Michael, Peter Ryan was a publisher and later boss of Melbourne University Press.
Oh, was he? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Can I ask one obvious question, Michael? You've had a previous career that probably everyone is aware of. what drew you to writing about Australian military history? I believe it started with the RAAF, but can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, I never have a coherent answer for this. I don't come from a military family. Well, the more I know about my grandfather, he was in the Navy. He had quite a remarkable war in the Pacific, but he died when I was very young, and he was actually in Darwin for virtually all the raids, including the first one. And he was most likely on the wharf unloading that morning when the Japanese came in and dropped bombs on the wharf on which he was standing. And according to my uncle, who's still going, he saw dreadful things around him, men being decapitated and awful things, and went on to serve in the war. He then had another lucky escape in that he was at Garden Island a couple of months later, and he missed the last tram back to his digs on the Cutterball, the ferry that was sunk by the Japanese midget submarines that night. And he should have been sleeping in his bunk when it was sunk, but he was in a boarding house on the other side of town. He was on minesweepers. But apart from that, my father was too young for the Second World War. No one in the First. I don't really know. I've always just had an interest in it. I made model aeroplanes when I was a child and that sort of thing. But I've always liked untold stories, and we certainly have a plethora of untold stories from that period. More so, the more I dig in the Pacific. My next book actually is going to be, and it'll be probably my last one in this, is going to be on the Borneo campaign in 1945. The last one, and perhaps the most controversial one, in that we probably didn't need to do it, but do it we did. And Balikpapan and Tarakan and all those sorts of places. It's where Bruce Ruxton went ashore, apparently, the former fiery head of the RSL. But so if anybody's got any observations or material I can throw my way on Borneo 45, I'd love to accept it.
Right. You got time for that very brief?
Bismarck Sea. All right. This is all right. This is like 30 seconds, because I did a presentation on Bismarck Sea last year. The last gasp of Japan really to reinforce on the ground their people in New Guinea was via a surface convoy, a large, for the Pacific, surface convoy of, I think, something up to 12 big ships, all carrying something like a division or half a division of men. They crammed these big boats, and it set off from Rabaul on the first, I think the last day of February 1943. Intelligence was aware that this big convoy was heading for Lae. If it had got there, it would have been diabolical, because the Australians and Americans in early 1943 were exhausted. Kokoda had been won, but at terrible cost, and the conditions were nightmarish, and the morale was very low. If the Japs got another foothold in northern New Guinea, it would have been disastrous, and they were about to do so because they'd had a smaller convoy get through a few weeks earlier, virtually unscathed. And it was figured that we don't really have the means to destroy them. Luckily, the Americans had started to arrive with the 6th Air Force, and they worked out a way in conjunction with the Australian Beaufighters to attack ships on the surface. And they had a plan, they had a rehearsal to bomb them from various levels in force, beginning with strafing the decks with the Beaufighters, and then skip bombing, dropping bombs along the surface, because it's very hard to hit them at high altitude, because they could maneuver very quickly. And it worked. It was one of the most important and quickest battles of the Second World War. It was all over essentially in 20 minutes. The Japanese didn't stand a chance. All of the cargo ships were sunk. Every single one of them was sent to the bottom at great loss of life. And 2 of the 4 escorting destroyers were also sunk. Bizarrely, I've just read that one of the destroyers that didn't survived the entire war and is now in a museum in Tokyo without a shot. If you're going to be in the Japanese Navy, that was a ship to be on. And it went right through from the beginning, quite incredible. Anyway, the Bismarck Sea was that. It is still the biggest sea engagement between aircraft and surface ships, just about certainly just about of the Second World War. And might be of otherwise, because there was something like 100 aircraft involved and 20 odd ships. And most in the Atlantic, most ships were sunk by single aircraft. So this was a big attack. And that was it. That was the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, a very quick and one-sided battle, and very important too.
Well, thank you very much. And I think we'll draw that, give you a rest, and let you retire for the evening. But I've got a couple of other announcements to make in relation to what's coming up from the MWHV. But Michael, if you want to, you can welcome to stay and listen. But if you want to depart, that everyone will be forgiving.
I'm going to wave goodbye to you all. Thank you very much. I'm going to have my dinner. And it's been great talking to you. Thank you so much. And thank
you very much. It was tremendous.
And thanks for the association for having me once again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brent and Jason.
Just a few messages about what's coming up. There'll be a 3-minute survey sent out as usual, and please answer that, everyone. It's very handy to have all that information. Our next speaker will be the distinguished historian Craig Stockings, discussing his new book out of the official history of the first book of volume 1 of the official history of the Australian peacekeeping operations in East Timor, called Born of Fire and Ash, Australian Operations in Response to East Timor Crisis 1999 to 2000. And that'll be on Zoom Wednesday, the 24th of May. So the information will be coming out about that. And we also have a one-day conference planned to be held on the Saturday, the 20th of May at Glen Waverley RSL. It's called The Tide Turns, 1943, Australia and the Pacific War. And it dovetails very nicely with what Michael has been talking about, particularly the Bismarck Sea was a very important prelude to that. And that's really all there is to say. This brings the evening session to a close. Thanks to Michael. Thanks also to Jason, who's as usual keeps the the show operating behind the scenes. And thank you everyone for coming. And I hope you come again. Good night to you from the committee and myself.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks, Brent.
Thank you.
Good night all.